Greetings, my name is Sergej Sumlenny. This is the first video in a series of lectures dedicated to the study of Russia. Russia as a threat, as a force that for centuries has sought and still seeks the destruction of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian nation. Having worked in Ukraine for several years, I had numerous discussions with my Ukrainian friends about what Russia is and how to predict its actions. Thanks to these conversations, the course you are watching is now being created. Before starting all this, I want to warn that Russian sources will be quoted in the lectures. They are harsh, often anti-Ukrainian. Another important disclaimer: I am a citizen of Germany, born and raised in what is now Russia. My thoughts and ideas should also be viewed through this context. Certainly, I am grateful primarily to the defense forces of Ukraine, who are defending not only Ukraine, but also my country, Germany, and thanks to whom I can record these videos. Special thanks to the projects The Last Capitalist and Ukrainian Peacekeeping School, which helped me make this video. Starting the conversation about Russia, first of all, we need to focus on the phrase nomen est omen, as Latin tells us. That is, the name defines. The name defines your life, how everything unfolds further. And with Russia, this expression is only confirmed. Unlike the name Rus, which is culturally and historically connected with state institutions in the territories of Ukraine, Russia, or Rossiya, is a name that came from the Greek language. As a self-designation, the word Rossiya appears only in 1721, when the Moscow Tsar Peter I proclaimed himself the Emperor of the Russian Empire. It was he who chose a foreign name for his new state. This is a very interesting point. In fact, the name was not characteristic of those who later became Russians. Neither the name Russians nor the form of government like an empire was familiar to the Muscovites. Peter I's Russia became an artificial construct. It was artificial in name and structure. It was artificial in almost all the institutions that appeared in it. The capital of the newly formed state was constructed from scratch. Petersburg is a city on a swamp, built in the style of Dutch cities, with a completely non-Russian name. I will deliberately use this adjective, non-Russian, as the opposite of what was before, since we are talking about the artificiality of the very idea of the so-called Russia. Then the state acquired all other artificial traits and manifestations. What were these manifestations? Well, for example, Peter abolished the prikaz system. These were bodies of centralized administration in Russia at the end of the 15th to the beginning of the 18th century. Of course, conditional Russia did not exist, but it needs to be called something. Instead, the so-called colleges were created. They were taken from Western management systems. Instead of the Boyar Duma, the Senate was introduced, and so on. The administrative territorial division of the country was created from districts headed by Zemstvo commissioners. Peter also abolishes the position of the Patriarch of Moscow, subordinates the Church to the state, and effectively creates a ministry of the Church, the Holy Synod, headed by the chief procurator of the Synod at the rank of minister. So nothing remained of the Church either. We will talk about all this in more detail later. But now we need to first understand what a fantastic break from everything that existed before was created by Peter when the state called Russia was born, which remains a problem for all its neighbors to this day. Interestingly, the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy saw this development of the system as follows. Yes, I warn again, here and further, I will quote Russian sources. With Peter I, the particularly striking and especially close and understandable to us horrors of Russian history begin. A raging, drunken, syphilis-ridden beast for a quarter of a century destroys people, executes, burns, buries the living in the ground, imprisons his wife, debauches, drinks for his own amusement, beheads, blasphemes. He travels with a semblance of a cross made from branches in the shape of genitalia and semblances of the Gospels, a box of vodka to glorify Christ, that is, to mock the faith, crowns himself and his lover, devastates Russia, executes his son, and dies of syphilis. And not only do they not remember his atrocities, but to this day they continue to praise the valor of this monster. And there is no end to all kinds of monuments to him. After him begins a series of horrors and atrocities similar to his reign. One harlot after another misbehaves on the throne, tortures and destroys the people, and they force some to torment others. And she ascends the throne without any rights, a murderer of men, a harlot terrifying in her depravity, giving full freedom to the atrocities of her shifting lovers. And all the horrors, executions, the murder of her husband, the torment and murder of the legitimate heir, the enslavement of half of Russia, wars, corruption, and the ruin of the people, all are forgotten and still praised as some kind of greatness, wisdom, almost moral high ground of this vile. Not only do they praise her, but they also praise her beastly lovers. The same with the patricide by Alexander, the same with Pushkin. Everything is forgotten, and non-existent virtues and merits for the fatherland are invented. So, from the perspective of Tolstoy and many others besides him, Peter invents Russia, ultimately establishing those forms of violence. About violence as a separate value we will talk further. Those forms of violence, those forms of governing the country, society, even forms of destroying society, which evidently existed before him, but were solidified and turned into a principle during his time. What existed during the times of the Moscow Tsars, Alexei Mikhailovich and Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov. Earlier, before the Romanovs, Tsar Ivan the Terrible, and even earlier during the times of the great princes, like Ivan III, up to the Moscow princes, such as Ivan Kalita. By the way, regarding Kalita, this person, as we remember, collected taxes for the Golden Horde from other princes and kept a little for himself. Naum Korzhavin spoke sarcastically, but very aptly about Kalita as the founder of the Russian style of governance. He was a Soviet Jewish poet who was born in Kiev on Zhilyanska Street and died in the United States after emigrating in 1973. Naum Korzhavin wrote about Kalita like this: "Today we sing your glory, and probably not without reason. The founder of a powerful state, Moscow Prince Ivan Kalita. You were quite repulsive in appearance, vile at heart, but that's not the point. Historically progressive turned out to be your life's path." This is a poem from 1954, and it is evident that Korzhavin is being ironic about the Stalinist concept of incorporating princes, tsars, feudal lords, generals, marshals, and so on from the Tsarist times into their imperial ideology. But we will talk about all this later. The main point mentioned by Korzhavin is that people who were absolutely immoral from our point of view, and even in their own time, turned into those who created this system. What was Russia like? What did Peter I create? Undoubtedly a unique country without borders, without ties to a location, moreover, without ties to history, to the population, to religion. It had nothing, no form that would limit its expansion. Russia could proclaim any territory to be Russian. When in Ukraine it is said that Ukrainians need to rely on something in history to draw strength for the struggle, in Russia it turns out to be different. The strength of Russia is in the absence of form. The strength of Russia is that it can be anything and anyone. This somewhat contradicts the idea that form and history support a country. In Russia, the strength is the absence of any form. In this context, it is very interesting to recall Vladimir Putin's words that the borders of Russia never end. They acquire an interesting significance and very ironically rhyme with Peter I's decision to give the country a non-existent name, a new form of government, new names for state institutions, and other completely new things. It's interesting how this was formulated by the poet Fyodor Tyutchev in his poem attributed to the year 1848 or 1849. Tyutchev was a diplomat of the Russian Empire in Germany, in one of the German states in Württemberg, and then was a censor in Moscow and understood very well how to sell the concept of Russia in the West. He is the author of the saying that Russia cannot be understood with the mind, which is actually used by Russians to explain to Germans or other Europeans that Russia should be forgiven for everything it does, because it is impossible to understand it, so to speak. Fyodor Tyutchev wrote the poem Russian Geography. Moscow and the city of Peter and the city of Constantine, here are the cherished capitals of the Russian kingdom. But where is its limit and where are its borders? To the north, to the east, to the south, and to the west. Future times will reveal their destinies, 7 internal seas and 7 great rivers from the Nile to the Neva, from the Elbe to China, from the Volga to the Euphrates, from the Ganges to the Danube. This is the Russian realm, and it will not come in age. As the Spirit foresaw and Daniel predicted. That is, we see that the concept of Russia as a state without borders, as a state that expands as much as it can and absorbs everything, turning everything into Russia, is not new. It was created by Peter. It was strengthened under Catherine, during the times of other tsars and realms, and now it is used by Vladimir Putin in the same way as it was used before. During Stalin's time in the USSR, when the emblem of a new Union Republic could be created from absolutely anything and any territory, could be declared a new republic of the Soviet Union. This led to Russia as a state finding an entirely new type of power, a new source fueling its aggressive expansion. Was such a system of power previously characteristic of this territory? And here we come to an interesting question. When people in Ukraine talk about Russia, they often call it a horde, as if this should explain why Russia is aggressive, why it seeks to capture neighbors, impose its power on them, destroy any resistance, even hints of this resistance. Interestingly, this is most likely not related to the historical trauma of the capture of Kiev by the Golden Horde at the beginning of the 13th century, because we see that similar comparisons of Russia with a horde exist in many cultures. It is present in Poland. It can be found in the theses of people from the Baltic countries. And even in the statements of American researchers, it can also be found. Yes, but is it fair? We know that, let's say, the country of Mongolia, where the legacy of Genghis Khan is quite valued, is a democracy and does not try to capture its neighbors. And in general, the level of freedom there is greater than in Russia, for example. And can we even talk about something that happened 700 years ago or 600 years ago? Can it influence so strongly and decisively how states develop today? What is interesting is that the Russians also use this comparison, and they use it from different aspects. They use it as a source of strength and as a source of criticism. Let's look at what the Russian poet Alexander Blok said at one time. Alexander Blok stayed in Petersburg after the February and October revolutions of 1917 and wrote poems, once again admiring the revolutionary spirit. In 1918, he wrote his almost programmatic poem, The Scythians. And here, one should not be surprised that he addresses not the Mongols. The Mongols appear separately in the text, but to the Scythians, for Blok, this was both a symbol of a wild, non-European, separate system built on violence and plunder. Obviously, this had nothing in common with the historical Scythians. But we are not talking now about how much Russians' perceptions of themselves align with reality, but about this perception itself, what it is, whom they are oriented towards. So, Scythians. There are millions of you, but we are more numerous. Try, fight with us. Yes, Scythians we are. Yes, Asians, we with slanted and greedy eyes. For you, centuries; for us, a single hour. We, like obedient serfs, held a shield between two hostile races, the Mongols and Europe. Centuries, your old horn forged and drowned out the thunder with an avalanche, and the collapse was a wild tale for you, and Lisbon and Messina. For hundreds of years, you looked to the east, accumulating and melting our pearls, and you, mocking, only counted the time to aim the cannon's muzzle. Russia is a sphinx. Rejoicing and grieving and drenched in black blood, it looks at you, with both hatred and love. Yes, to love as our blood loves, none of you have loved for a long time. You have forgotten that in the world there is a love that both burns and destroys. We love everything, the heat of cold numbers and the gift of divine visions. Everything is clear to us, the sharp Gallic wit and the somber German genius. We remember everything, the hell of Parisian streets and the coolness of Venice, the distant aroma of lemon groves and the smoky masses of Cologne. We love the flesh, its taste, its color, and the suffocating mortal scent of flesh. Are we guilty if your skeleton crunches in our heavy, tender paws? We are used to grabbing the reins of spirited horses, breaking the heavy backs of the horses, and taming rebellious female slaves. Come to us from the horrors of war, come into peaceful embraces before it's too late. The old sword in its sheath, and comrades, we will become brothers. But if not, we have nothing to lose, and treachery is available to us. For centuries, you will be cursed by the sickly late descendants. We will widely part before beautiful Europe through the wilderness and forests. We will turn to you our Asian face. Come all, come to the Urals. We are clearing a place for the battle of steel machines, where the integral breathes with the wild Mongolian horde. But we ourselves are no longer your shield. From now on, we will not enter the battle ourselves. We will watch how the mortal battle boils with our narrow eyes. We will not move when the fierce Hun rummages through the pockets of corpses, burns cities, drives herds into churches, and roasts the meat of white brothers. For the last time, come to your senses, old world, to the brotherly feast of labor and peace for the last time, to the bright brotherly feast, calls the barbarian. The year 1918. In fact, Blok will die in Petersburg in 3 years. They will not let him go for treatment from Petersburg, and he will die there, never having received satisfaction from this destruction of Europe. But in this poem, the following points are interesting. Firstly, there is a sense of resentment towards the West. These are threats. We can read absolutely everything, both the fascination with sexualized violence and the promise to kill, and the fascination with the possibility of committing violence, limitless violence, widespread violence. And rhetoric about brothers and rhetoric about peace. That is, he appears to speak from the position of someone offering peace. But this proposal is rejected by the West. And it should also be remembered that this person was completely westernized, fully integrated into the European context, yet still used such models for the ultimate demonstration and formation of the Russian concept of communication with the outside world. Thus, Blok's Scythians are a kind of quintessence of concepts from modern Russian mythology. Was Blok the only Russian who referred to the image of the Asian horde? No, he was not. Another poet who turned to this image was Alexei Tolstoy, and this was a bit earlier, in 1867. Tolstoy, who often addressed historical themes and political metaphors, wrote the poem Zmei Tugarin. First of all, it is an attempt, far from the first and not the last, to appropriate the history of Ukraine, Russia, Kyiv. But in this context, that's not so much interesting. What's interesting here is that Tolstoy essentially describes the history of the development of the Russian state as the story of the corruption of good old Russia by the Tatars. And the plot is not complicated. Prince Volodymyr, surrounded by his retinue, his army, legendary warriors, including Ilya Muromets, Dobrynya Nikitich, and others, is celebrating something in Kiev. And a singer comes to him, appearing as the demonic serpent Tugarin. I quote again in Russian with slight omissions. The singer continues, "And the time will come, our Khan will yield to the Christians, and the Russian people will rise again, and one of you will gather the land, but he himself will become the Khan over it, and he will sit in his tower like an idol in a temple, and he will beat with a whip on your backs, and you will bow and bow to him. Oh shame, oh bitter shame." And he continues baring his teeth. You will adopt our customs, you will learn to live in dishonor, and then, having indulged in Tatar ways to your heart's content, you will call it Rus. And you quarreled with the honorable old times, and with the great ancestor Nasor, not listening to the voice of your native blood, you will say, We will turn our backs to the west and face the Tatars. This plot ends with the expulsion of this serpent from Kiev. But Alexei Tolstoy's concept is as follows. He considers the unjust, violent nature of Russian power to be a consequence of the system's corruption by the Horde. Is it fair? Is it worth seeing the occupation of the northern provinces of Ukraine by Russia in the 13th century, specifically the Vladimir Suzdal Principality with the Golden Horde, as the sole and main factor that on these lands, after the Moscow Principality, after the Moscow Tsardom, a state grew that was a source of violence and a state of cruelty for much longer than the prolonged rule of the Horde? Let's pose the question differently. Was the Russia of Peter, or the Russia of Catherine, or the Russia of Stalin or Putin determined by the fact that in the 14th century the Moscow princes collected money for the Khan's court? Especially since Mongolia is now a democratic country, as we have already mentioned, with electoral changes of power, despite being squeezed between totalitarian China and Russia. It seems that justifying the entire history of Russian violence, supposedly by the Horde legacy, is weak and insufficient. An interesting approach to evaluating this issue was made by the tandem of Russian researchers Yuri Sergeyevich Pivovarov and Andrei Ilyich Fursov. They actually turned into an illustration of their own research. Yuri Pivovarov began to criticize the Russian authorities, called the Russian regime terrorist, and ended up having to leave Russia and now lives in Germany. And Andrei Fursov turned into a troubadour of totalitarianism, a seeker of conspiracy by the Rockefeller family, and gives lectures about the greatness of Russia to Russian state youth organizations. But in the 90s, they joked about Alexei Tolstoy the Younger. Not the one who wrote about the dragon Tugarin, but the one who wrote Elita Peter I. And reworked Pinocchio into Buratino, that he was a Russian writer, could not imagine in a terrible dream that he would become Soviet. After all, these two researchers, Fursov and Pivovarov, were researchers of what they described as the Russian system, a distinct type of power and its relations with the population. This type, as they wrote, developed consistently, not without the influence of the Horde, but far from solely because of the Horde. Moreover, it managed to become so natural and stable that it remains almost unchanged despite the radical changes in Russia's state system. That is, during the times of the Empire, Stalin, Brezhnev, and Putin, some basic aspects of the Russian state remain. And here it is worth mentioning two expressions. The first is, if I fall asleep and wake up in 100 years and they ask me what is happening in Russia now, I will answer, drinking and stealing. In fact, it is unclear who this quote belongs to. It is attributed to the historian Karamzin, the civil servant, writer Saltykov-Shchedrin, and other people. But this only underscores how accurately it resonates with Russian realities. And the second saying, in Russia everything changes in 5 years, but in 100 years nothing changes. Again, this saying cannot be attributed to anyone specific, who said it or when. But it also describes the Russian system very accurately. The important thing here is not who said it, but that indeed Russia of Tsars, emperors, Bolsheviks, general secretaries, and later presidents demonstrates the same consistent patterns of behavior that remain absolutely stable and are reproduced despite all social, political, economic, and other cataclysms. Russia becomes like a liquid metal terminator that reassembles into the same form again and again, despite all the explosions, injuries, and severed limbs, as if following some secret law of its existence. The aforementioned Pivovarov and Fursov and Yuri Pivovarov was my academic advisor and an intellectually honest person who stated, for example, live on Russian television when it was still possible to have live broadcasts, that he was ashamed for never having resisted the communist regime with arms when he was young. So Pivovarov and Fursov based their theory on the assumption that the main value of Russia is power. People do not come to power to make money or change something. People come to power, to have the ability to commit violence. Not religious authority, not institutions. Nothing but power and violence are the fanatical foundation of the Russian system. That is why power as a structure is a separate actor and has nothing to do with the people. More precisely, there is no people in Russia, only a population. If you ask Russians whether Russia is a value, they will say yes. But what is this Russia for them? Russians will complain about bad roads, corruption, their poor life, the lack of money, yet at the same time admire the state's, Russia's ability to commit violence. For Russians, it is happiness to understand that Russia can destroy its neighbors, and they are ready to agree to such a contract, despite the fact that their life around them, looks bad. Sometimes, by the way, violence takes on sophisticated forms. For example, demonstrative lying is a type of violence. Why do Putin, for example, or Lavrov, or other Russian politicians lie? When it is clear to everyone that they are lying, this is perceived as their weakness, but in reality it is a demonstration of strength. They force people to listen to their lies, and the normalization of lies and the ability to lie are considered virtues in Russia. From the perspective of Russians, such behavior is a sign of the highest level of power. You can lie to a foreign president, and he is forced to listen to you. Since there are no sources of power other than the person of the dictator, Tsar, emperor, or president, and the center of this power is very far away for many Russians, it is perceived that this cannot be changed, it cannot be influenced. You can only join power as something that gives you the opportunity to also commit violence. And power is understood very fundamentally as the ability to commit violence both inside the country and outside. Russians, who do not consider it realistic or even necessary to have villages and even cities with sewage systems, take pride in the ability to destroy other states and inflict critical harm on the world. Interestingly, the French diplomat Marquis de Custine, who worked in Russia in the 19th century and left his sarcastic memoirs, for which he is hated in Russia, quite said, "The Russian Tsar keeps his subjects in such a terrible state that they did not grieve when they had to go to war to die." This is quite a note, it remains relevant. But let's return to violence as a fundamental value of relationships within Russia. The Russian poet Alexander Pushkin formulated this very briefly in his poem, constructed as a dialogue between gold and steel. "All is mine," said gold. "Everything is mine," said steel. "I will buy everything," said gold. "I will take everything," said steel. Interestingly, Pushkin actually translated, with a bit of creative reinterpretation, a French epigram that he knew, which was published in 1816 in Anthologie Française, and it went like, "Tout est à moi, car je l'achète." Everything is mine because I buy it. But it is precisely Pushkin's lines that characterize the key law of Russian reality, not French. They form this dichotomy, financial power and the power of violence. When in 2003, Russian billionaire Boris Khodorkovsky entered into conflict with the president, not yet a dictator, Vladimir Putin, let's remember that Putin was still playing the role of an open democratic leader. Then Khodorkovsky clearly reiterated this very dichotomy. Khodorkovsky told Putin during the latter's meeting with the so-called oligarchs that the state exists on the money of business. Therefore, it should heed the wishes of wealthy people. And this offended Putin. He clearly demonstrated to Khodorkovsky that the sword can take everything, while gold cannot ultimately buy anything. If not of the Horde, then what is the nature of power in Russia? The question of the primacy of power, power not as law, not as agreement, not as compromise, not even as tradition, but as violence, is dominant in Russia. In 1564 to 79, the Moscow Tsar, the first to actually call himself Tsar, Ivan IV the Terrible, corresponded with Prince Andrei Kurbsky, who fled from his rule. In the correspondence, Kurbsky, who was in Livonia, accused Ivan of breaking the rules. Ivan executed the boyars without trial. Ivan confiscates their property, destroys the law. And Ivan replied to him, "I am free to grant favors to my serfs, and also free to execute them." That is, for Ivan the Terrible, there were neither princes, nor aristocrats, nor a court. There were only serfs who depended solely on him, the single center of power, his sympathies or lack thereof. As Yuri Pivovarov said, this is an incredible, unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of one person. Power that respects neither compromise, nor agreement, nor law, nor tradition. This is pure power. Or, as Emperor Paul I would say 200 years later in a conversation with the French ambassador, "In Russia, the important person is only the one I am speaking to, and only while I am speaking to them." Or, as Joseph Stalin would prove to his commissars and ministers, that each of them could end up in a concentration camp, where, by the way, their wives are already sitting, for example, the wife of the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, Polina, or the wife of the formal head of the USSR, he was the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, Mikhail Kalinin, Yekaterina. This system, obviously, has lasted much longer than the state forms of Russia. Sometimes it can generate almost comedic situations. For example, there is a well-known situation in modern Russia where one of the Russian bankers ended up in prison and lost all his property because he was once driving in his car, a car with bodyguards. Rublyovskoye Highway is a road that leads from Moscow to a very affluent area near Moscow, and he was overtaken by some car. It was a BMW 3rd Series, meaning a good but not very expensive car, and it overtook him, his motorcade, and this seemed to him somewhat impolite. He was offended. How can one overtake the motorcade of such a respectable gentleman on the road? His guard stopped this car, pulled out the driver, who was a citizen of the Netherlands, beat him and left him in the car. That same evening, this Russian banker was visited at his estate by Russian FSB agents, who arrested and beat him. And all this ended with imprisonment and loss of property. It turned out that this Dutch driver was the husband of one of Vladimir Putin's daughters. This shows that power builds its hierarchies. And for this banker, it was obviously impossible to see that someone was overtaking him, and he did not recognize in this person someone higher than him in the hierarchy, because this person was from another system of coordinates and did not showed all its true characteristics outwardly. But in the end, the Russian power system prevailed in this system, and the one who was more senior in these hierarchies showed the one who was not senior where his place really was. How does a society of such a system of power exist? Violence serves as a tool for everything, from family to foreign policy. Children are raised with violence. Relations between companies, between institutions, are built on violence. Foreign policy is also built on violence. This can be traced through many centuries. The remarkable Ukrainian historian Sergej Sumlenny described the situation as far back as the 17th century, where violence was used as a demonstration and as a diplomatic method, meaning not polite, but outward directed. He writes in his book, The Gates of Europe, the Tsarist officials wanted their subjects to understand that they would not tolerate any violations of the Union with Moscow under any circumstances. In January of the year 1660, the Moscow voivodes sent Khmelnytsky a message that proved this thesis. The corpse of Danilo Vyhovsky was delivered to the young hetman's ancestral estate in Subotiv. The brother of the former hetman and the cousin of Yuri Khmelnytsky, who fell into the hands of the Muscovites during an unsuccessful attack on the Moscow garrison in Kiev. The abductors of Danilo tortured him to death. What the hetman saw in the coffin made him cry. His entire body was torn to pieces by whips, his eyes gouged out, eye sockets filled with silver, ears turned inside out, drilled and filled with silver, reported a Polish diplomat who was there at the time. His fingers were cut, his legs were slit along the veins. In a word, it was unheard of savagery. In fact, similar demonstrations of violence continued to occur. Here is what Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, who also served in the Russian army and knew how the Russian army operates, writes. And in his novel Haji Murat, he describes the consequences of the Russian army's actions in Chechnya. The village ravaged by the raid was the very one where Haji Murat spent the night before going to the Russians. Returning to his village, Sado found his house destroyed, the roof collapsed, and the doorposts, galleries, balconies burned, and the interior defiled. His son, that beautiful boy with shining eyes, who looked at Haji Murat with admiration, was brought dead to the mosque on a horse covered with a burqa. He had been stabbed in the back with a bayonet. A respectable woman who had served Haji Murat during his visit, now in a shirt torn at the chest, revealing her old sagging breasts with dishevelled hair, stood over her son and scratched her face until it bled, howling continuously. Sado, with a pickaxe and shovel, went with relatives to dig his son's grave. The old grandfather sat by the ruin, by the wall of the ruined house, and whittling a stick, stared blankly ahead. He had just returned from his apiary. The 2 haystacks there had been burned, the apricot and cherry trees planted and tended by the old man were broken and scorched, and most importantly, all the beehives with bees were burned. The wailing of women was heard in all the houses and squares where 2 more bodies had been brought. Small children cried along with their mothers. The hungry livestock also bellowed, as there was nothing to feed them. The older children did not play but looked at the adults with frightened eyes. The fountain was fouled, obviously on purpose, so water could not be taken from it. The mosque was also fouled, and the mullah with the students was cleaning it. The elder hosts gathered in the square and, sitting on their haunches, discussed their situation. No one even spoke of hatred towards the Russians. The feeling that all Chechens, from young to old, experienced was stronger than hatred. It was not hatred, but a refusal to recognize these Russian dogs as humans, and such disgust, revulsion and bewilderment at the absurd cruelty of these creatures that the desire to exterminate them, like the desire to exterminate rats, poisonous spiders and wolves, was as natural a feeling as the instinct for self-preservation. The story Haji Murat by Tolstoy was not published anywhere until after his death. It was made public only after he died. But these behavior patterns of the Russian army, they are consistent, as we know. And in the same way as the Russian military leader Suvorov led the destruction of Warsaw and the destruction of the Warsaw district of Praga, this is the massacre in Praga. In the same way, this continued further, even up to modern times, when the Russians left behind the same things, including feces in houses and murdered children, and with all cultural, architectural and other property destroyed, with rapes, tortures and so on in Ukrainian cities, in Bucha, in Irpin, in Izium and so on. Inside the society, not outside, the primacy of violence means the absence of any compensatory mechanisms. What were similar mechanisms in Western states or in Ukraine? The church, universities, courts, trade unions, other public institutions are actually additional systems of state control over the population in Russia. There are no independent institutions, only state control institutions. The concept of independent universities, an independent academy of sciences, an independent church is not just hostile to Russia, it is incomprehensible. The first university in Russia, Moscow University, was founded in 1755, much later than the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. As the Moscow University is quite managed by people fully integrated into the state control system, such as the rector of Moscow State University Sadovnichi, who is a constant figure and a trusted person of Vladimir Putin, or for many decades, from the times of Stalin to the times of Putin, the dean of the Faculty of Journalism Zasursky. The same goes for the Russian Church, not only a scientific institution like the Academy of Sciences or a university, but also the Church was deprived of independence back in the 18th century and was further deprived of independence during the times of Stalin and later Putin. But in fact, these interesting relations between the Church and the state began not even during the time of Peter. They started a little earlier, during the time of Peter's father, Alexei Mikhailovich. It was during the reign of Tsar Alexei in the Moscow Tsardom that the church reform of Patriarch Nikon was carried out, which led to the emergence of the so-called Old Believers, people who did not accept the reforms. They were destroyed in a terrible manner, including being mass burned in churches and houses. Interestingly, the first Russian autobiography was written by the Old Believer Protopope Avakum, who was twice sent to Siberia and burned alive in the year 1682. In his autobiography, he writes, "So from the Nurcha River, we returned back to Russia. For 5 weeks, we traveled on sleds over bare ice. He gave me 2 nags for the kids and the belongings, while the priest's wife walked on foot, struggling on the ice. The country is barbaric, the foreigners are hostile, we dare not fall behind the horses, yet we can't keep up with them. Hungry, weary people. The poor priest's wife trudges on, then collapses. How many times? At another time, while trudging, she fell, and another weary person stumbled upon her and also fell right there. Both are shouting but cannot get up. The man shouts, "Mother Tsarina, forgive me," and the priest's wife shouts, "What are you doing, father? You crushed me." I came, and the poor woman reproaches me, saying, "How long will this torment of the priest last?" And I say, "My dear, until death itself." She sighed and replied, "All right, my dear, we will move until it comes." If we look at this text, it is hard not to see parallels with the so-called camp literature. Camp literature, by Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, and other writers from the Stalin era. Thus, the initiator of church reforms, Patriarch Nikon, did not enjoy his power for long. He lost the favor of the Tsar. In the year 1666, a council was convened at which Nikon was deprived of the rank of patriarch and, as a simple monk, exiled to a monastery, effectively for life imprisonment. It is interesting to see what Nikon was accused of. He presented himself as a monarch, wearing signs of power and wealth. He founded monasteries with unlawful names: New Jerusalem, Golgotha, Bethlehem, Jordan, mocking and ridiculing divine things. Called himself the Patriarch of New Jerusalem, unlawfully seized property for his monasteries, and behaved arrogantly at the council, insulting all patriarchs and Greek rules. Let us note that 300 years later, Marshal Georgy Zhukov was removed from the position of Minister of Defense for similar accusations. He was removed from his influential position and transferred to the position of head of the Odessa military district. We compare the wording of the accusations against Zhukov with those directed at Patriarch Nikon. Zhukov is rude and arrogant, flaunting his achievements with banners on the road saying, "Glory to Marshal Zhukov." Zhukov's dacha is essentially an antique shop or museum, adorned inside with various expensive art paintings, and there are so many that 4 paintings even hang in the kitchen. It has come to the point that in Zhukov's bedroom, above the bed, there is a huge painting depicting 2 nude women. There is not a single Soviet book in the dacha. Instead, the bookshelves are filled with a large number of books in beautiful bindings with gold embossing, exclusively in German. Entering the house, it's hard to imagine that you are near Moscow and not in Germany. That is, 300 years have passed. The state system has changed. But the way a patriarch of the church or a marshal, who was declared the marshal of victory, is removed from their position does not differ at all in terms of wording or consequences. Again, in the Russian system, property, influence, position, and fame mean nothing without the ability to commit violence. One of the most interesting Russian writers who described this mechanism of violence permeating all layers of society is Vladimir Sorokin. In Ukraine, he is known more for his recent works, such as Day of the Oprichnik and The Sugar Kremlin. Both books are a satire on the Putin power system, which is based on FSB violence and cooperation with China. We will turn to another interesting story by Sorokin, The Norm. This is an older book, and it describes how Sorokin wrote at that time in the style of socialist realism. It depicts the classic life of some families in the typical Soviet political system. People meet, say some banalities, make long speeches about the political system, discuss some of their everyday matters. And when you read this book, The Norm, it seems that they live in a world identical to the normal, typical Soviet world. But it differs in just one thing, and this one thing is the norm itself. Because at a certain point, you realize that every day they are all given some kind of norm. What this norm is unclear, and they eat this norm. They all find it unpleasant to eat this norm, and they talk about whose norm is more disgusting, because there are no non-disgusting ones. Whose norm is disgusting? What ways do they find to make it less disgusting? Who received a better norm today? Who worse? And everyone eats this norm. Obviously, there is some war veteran who says that in our times the norm was much worse. Now it's better for you. They are aware that people from the bureaucratic apparatus are given a less disgusting norm, and it's unclear what this norm is. And only after some page do you realize that this norm is feces. They all receive their daily portion of feces. And to ordinary people, and the wealthy, and ministers, and some teachers, and locksmiths, and retired women, they are brought feces, and they constantly eat these feces. And only in this way do they demonstrate their loyalty to the authorities. This is the base, the foundation of the Russian system. Regardless of your position, you receive your portion of the norm. The combination of sweetly pathetic emotional admiration for Russia and brutal, seemingly at first glance, senseless violence, but in reality, violence that adds strength and life to this system. Very well described by the same Vladimir Sorokin in his other novel, The Road Story. What I cannot get is how one cannot love the native birches. A person born and raised in Russia does not love their nature, does not understand its beauty, its flood meadows, morning forest, endless fields, nightingale's night trills, autumn leaf fall, first snow, July haymaking, wide steppe, Russian song, Russian character. After all, you are Russian. You were born in Russia. You went to high school, you wrote essays, you served in the army, you studied at a technical school, you worked at a factory. Have you been to Bobruisk? Have you been to Bobruisk? Have you been to Bobruisk? Have you, huh? Did you go to Bobruisk, huh? Did you go? Why are you silent? Have you been to Bobruisk? Huh? Why are you pretending, huh? Stuck, right? Did you go to Bobruisk? You jerk. Went to Bobruisk? You went bastard, you went scum. Went bastard, went damn, went damn, went damn, why are you whining? Went bitch, went damn, went damn, went damn, why are you whining? Why are you sniffling, bastard? What, huh? Whining, whining, bastard? Why are you sniffling? So damn, so take it, take it, take it, take it, take it, damn, like this, like this, like this, like this, damn. Here, damn, take it, damn, here, damn. Take it, take it, take it, take it. Here, damn, take it, bitch, take it, damn. Here, damn. Here, you bastard. Here, you bastard. Complaining, damn. Stuck, damn. We continue to study the enemy. In the next videos, we will examine more specific issues. What Russian nationalism and imperialism are. What the relations between Russia and the West are. Or how Russians see themselves and what this leads to. And most importantly, how, using this knowledge, can we inflict the greatest amount of harm on them? We continue to study the enemy.